Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for a great way to tee off this this discussion of merger control globally. I think we have a fantastic panel to shed further light on some of the issues that Sarah alluded to, on latest developments, and to help understand kind of sources of convergence and divergence across jurisdictions. I think great group of people to talk this through with you. We have Florian Ederer, who is the Allen and Kelly Quoistrom Professor in Markets, Public Policy and Law at Boston University. I think it's fair to say he's most famous in antitrust circles for his killer acquisitions paper with Colleen Cunningham and Song Ma, but his research covers a broader range of topics, including the drivers of innovation and the impact of common ownership. Guillaume Loriot is, of course, the Deputy Director General for Mergers at DG Comp. Professor Marshall Van Alstyne is a Professor of Information Systems, also at the Quoistrom School of Business at Boston University. He's one of the foremost experts on platforms and network business models, and has conducted research on multiple topics of great interest to competition practitioners, including the welfare effects of compatibility requirements and interoperability. And then last but not least, and fresh from his keynote earlier, we have Michael Cadiz, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division at the US Department of Justice. So Sarah's teed us off sort of raised a couple of substantive issues around merger control, how to think about potential competition and dynamic competition, how to make assessments of the evidence under uncertainty. And to kick us off, I'd like to start with Florian, because this sort of dovetails a bit with Michael's references earlier in the day to how economic analysis can kind of change the approach to policy. And I think it's fair to say that your paper on killer acquisitions was a major part of the intellectual foundations for some of the shifts we've seen in merger control over the last few years, including this greater focus on potential and dynamic competition. And I'm sort of reminded of the John Maynard Keynes quote that those in authority, whether they realize it or not, sort of channeling the words of some academic scribbler from a few years back. So as an academic scribbler par excellence, could you kind of tell us a bit about how you see your ideas being applied, and maybe also speak about how, obviously, your paper was looking at the pharmaceutical industry. Those ideas have been sort of mapped into new sectors like digital and tech, and have we learned more in recent years about how to apply these ideas to those sectors?
Well, thank you very much, Ollie. That is the most generous comparison I've ever received. I hope, however, that my own academic work is slightly less impenetrable and an easier read than Keynes's general theory of employment, interest in money, which I myself started reading a couple of times in my career and never finished. So I think Killer Acquisitions is both a more catchier title and probably an easier read for those of you who have not read it. I would, of course, love to tell you that my work has been so influential and has had such tremendous impact and such strong deterrence effects that killer acquisitions are a thing of the past. But of course, that's not true. But in fact, the reality is quite different. There have been impacts, but we're only starting. This is very much the beginning and not the end of all of this. Let me begin also, as always, with a fairly pedantic point about defining what a killer acquisition is. It's a term that gets sort of thrown around a little bit loosely at times, since my co-authors and I first coined it. In our paper, we define it as the acquisition of a target firm and the subsequent elimination of an existing or future competing product. So it is the acquirer that's dominant, acquiring some target, and then shutting down the innovation of that target because it would otherwise compete with an existing product or potentially a future product of the acquirer. It's not surprising that has both harms to innovation, but also has harms then to, on the side of prices, potentially of quality. But what you can only detect at an early stage is the stuff on innovation, whether the product actually sees the light of day or whether it comes to market. Now, our paper showed this systematically in the case of pharma acquisitions. The theory of harm is, of course, much, much more general than that and does apply to many other markets. Why pharma? It's because that was the easiest thing to do. As a researcher, you always look for the stuff that's easiest to do. You look for places where the market delineations are extremely clear, where it is extremely clear what competes with what and what in the future might compete with what. And that's only possible at a large scale in pharmaceuticals. We, of course, would have loved to immediately write a paper on saying, look at all these tech acquisitions and look at how the negative effects of these acquisitions have had on innovation, but that is a much, much harder thing to quantify. The most important thing that has changed since we wrote that paper, and in fact, since I was last here on this stage, so thank you again for having me back despite the incendiary things that I said last time around, there's now tremendous awareness around this phenomenon. It's in the media. The lawmakers have heard of it. Even my mother-in-law has heard of it. It's entered common parlance, although not always with the right usage, but I think mostly with the right usage. Sometimes I feel a little bit like that sorcerer's apprentice that can't quite control the ghosts that he summoned, or the spirits that he summoned, and feel very similar about that term that I created. But there is tremendous awareness, and the awareness brings a lot more scrutiny with it. When there's more scrutiny, that also means that firms become more hesitant. They might be deterred about engaging certain acquisitions that previously they could have passed through in a way that was rather unnoticeable. We've had some legal changes, so several countries have amended their laws and regulations to counter this problem. The antitrust agencies very much want to be notified of some of these smaller acquisitions, some of these acquisitions of potential competitors. And the fact that you have to notify the agencies is in itself already a little bit of a deterrent. Now, much of that credit shouldn't just go to our paper, but also to the work that Tom Woolman at Chicago Booth has done in his work on stealth acquisitions that very much is complementary to the work that we've done. But the DMA also requires designated gatekeepers to notify the antitrust authorities of acquisitions. Several countries have changed their laws, such that the notifications of acquisitions are not just triggered by revenue thresholds, which in these dynamic, fast-moving markets are a little bit redundant or just not relevant, but instead use market capitalization thresholds, which of course much more reflect the potential form of competition and the potential for markets in the future. In Europe, the notification system is such that the countries can also directly notify the Competition Commission, and so it doesn't have to be just at the European level, but it also can come directly from the member states. In the United States, in the proposed horizontal merger guidelines, they also specifically mention the elimination of nascent competitive threats. It doesn't specifically use the word kill acquisitions, but I think that is actually a good thing because the idea is much, much more broad-ranging and has much more bite in a variety of settings and not just a very, very extreme example of takeovers literally eliminating future products or existing products. The third important change, and that's of course intimately linked to the first two that I've mentioned, is the deterrence. If mergers with significant anti-competitive harm to future competition are more likely to be challenged, then the merging parties will think twice about whether they want to negotiate those deals. Management and investors may think about, well, should this deal really get out of the boardroom? Now, the optimistic answer is that this may be happening already, but it is much, much, much harder to quantify that. It's already difficult to quantify killer acquisitions, but it's even harder to quantify the absence of a phenomenon than just quantifying the phenomenon itself. And so if we're now thinking, well, has it had a bite? Well, we would have to see, well, has there been a reduction in killer acquisitions? If we're finding it hard to find those killer acquisitions in the first place, then not finding them might be even trickier. The other thing is that this is a pretty hard thing to prove. Now, in our setting, it was aided by the very specific aspects of pharmaceuticals. You know that certain products are competing with each other. They're not just competing in terms of the therapeutical treatment group, but they're also competing on the same mechanism of action. You know what is going to happen to all of these products. You know, do they progress to the next stage? Do they make it finally onto the market? In many, many other settings, we never find out what happened to an idea. We never find out what happened to a product. We never find out that it was that a patent was just tabled. And so there is also a very difficult aspect here that you have to prove here the counterfactual. What would have happened if this acquisition hadn't gone through? It's innovation that it just never is observed. And so that's very, very tricky. It's a high evidentiary standard that applies to all innovation-related merger challenges, but doubly so to ones relating to killer acquisitions. Okay. Now, the fourth point is, and the fourth change has an even more long-term view. So even though the past few years, I can say that probably have been the most tumultuous and exciting in antitrust and competition policy, the field still moves at a glacial pace. Okay? I like to tell my students always that there's nothing slower than antitrust in the United States. And while these ideas that we're putting forward are powerful, okay, they take a long time to take root. Okay? We need to teach them to our students, in my case, or we need to inform the judges. These students become judges or lawmakers over only a long time further down the road. It becomes it's quite a long time until these ideas become accepted. So when I'm seeing the criticism of some of the DMA, I'm also reminded by how controversial, for example, the 2010 horizontal merger guidelines in the United States were, okay, at the time. And then today, all the luminaries of the Chicago school think that they are perfectly fine. Okay, and so I think very similarly, probably we'll evaluate what is happening with the DMA and notifications and new theories of harm. We'll think probably in 10 years that this is perfectly standard and normal. The fifth change is that given that there's just much more thinking and awareness about killer acquisitions, there's also more awareness about other innovation theories of harm. Let me remind you that killer acquisitions are really the most extreme form, and therefore also the most easily detectable form, of anti-competitive acquisitions of nascent competitors. There are many, many other concerns beyond the shutdown of innovation activities of the target firm. It could be that the merged firms may invest less aggressively in innovation post-merger, or the acquiring firm may decide to terminate its own innovation, its own innovative products, because it can't just simply acquire the innovation of its potential competitor. Let me turn a little bit now from the very broad picture to a specific example of sort of what has happened. Where have we seen this manifest? So, Sarah already mentioned a few of these cases that involved innovation theories of harm. There are others, including MetaWithin, Illumina Grail, Pfizer Seagen. The one case I want to particularly highlight, and I can speak on that case because I'm not conflicted, but understand some of my panelists may be, so I'm comfortable maybe just pronouncing myself on my views on this without getting pushback from my panelists, is the EU's challenge of Adobe's proposed $20 billion acquisition of the cloud-based designer platform Figma. Yeah, and so the argument here is that acquisition hurts competition. It's a transaction that isn't particularly new. It was announced over a year ago, but as I said, antitrust takes a long time. This deal remains in regulatory limbo. And when the deal was announced, there were immediate questions about whether Adobe was taking a key competitor or a key future competitor of the market using blunt force of market and elimination of market power, or whether it was just filling in a missing piece in its product line. Now, a preliminary assessment of that deal already revealed a substantially lessening of competition in the UK. In the US, the Department of Justice is also reportedly preparing a lawsuit to block the transaction. Adobe has also already indicated it is ready to deal with probes, as the regulators have identified their scrutiny of many of these large tech acquisitions, including this one here. And this deal, which was announced in September 2022, values Figma at roughly 50 times its annual recurring revenue. Now, you might say that makes sense because there's all this opportunity for this future market, and we should, of course, take that into account. But there are also questions like, well, is this takeover sum so large because, not just because of the market opportunities, but because it would be so detrimental for the acquirer, in this case, Adobe, when this potential competitor in Figma really goes head-to-head with Adobe. Okay? Now, as a result of a more in-depth investigation, the Commission reached a preliminary conclusion that the transaction may actually significantly reduce competition in 2 global markets. And so the 2 that it highlights is, one, in the supply of interactive product design tools, where Figma is the clear market leader and Adobe is one of its largest competitors. And it argues that the transaction is likely to create a dominant player by combining these market positions. Okay? Furthermore, and this is the innovation partner of all of this, it will result in the discontinuation of Adobe's own interactive product design tool, which is Adobe XD, as well as any potential successor product. And now some people don't call this a killer acquisition, some people call this a reverse killer acquisition, but it's basically the same idea. It's just that rather than terminating the innovation of the target, you are terminating the innovation that you yourself are conducting because you can just buy it from the outside. The second aspect of it is that in the market for supply of vector editing tools and supply of raster editing tools, by eliminating Figma as a potential competitor, Adobe strengthens its own dominance in these markets. So the argument is that Figma already exerts a significant constraining influence on Adobe's vector editing tool, which is Adobe Illustrator, as well as the raster editing tool, which you all know, which is Photoshop. But the argument is here that absent this transaction, Figma is significantly likely to enter these markets. So it's not in these markets, but it would likely enter into these markets and grow into an effective competitive force. So very much these ideas of competing for a new market or elimination of a product that could potentially compete. So there's exactly the two aspects that Sarah also highlighted in the 2 cases that these discuss are at the front of this particular case here. Looking to the future, I think we do need a framework that categorizes all of these various aspects of horizontal mergers with an innovation component, and that one that goes a little bit beyond this outdated debate whether the 2 merging parties are truly in the same market. Okay, so I myself am a prisoner of this idea because I've written a paper where those markets are extremely clearly delineated. Okay? But that is extremely hard to do in most realistic settings, okay, outside of the academic avatar. Once we have such a framework, I think we can improve on it and prepare the ground for companies who also would benefit from reduced uncertainty whether or not their deals will be challenged. So, but this is very much a growing and exciting area to be in, and one where I think we will see many more challenges of deals, or perhaps companies also deciding not to bring deals because they are concerned that these will be challenged.
Cool. Thank you, Florian. And I think you've set out a few sort of mechanisms of interest and perhaps sort of hinted at some techniques we might use to filter transactions. I think valuation is a good example of how one can maybe look at a purchase price and say, how can this figure be rationalized? Can it be rationalized on a sort of positive basis or a benign basis, or can it only be sort of explained by some of the incentives that you've set out? So I'd like to turn to Guillaume next. It's obviously been an eventful year for merger control in Europe. We've had in Booking e-Treveli the first EC prohibition of a digital merger. We've also seen exploration of many of the theories we've discussed of potential dynamic competition, killer acquisitions, but also, particularly in the Bookings case, and other cases as well, development of more kind of non-horizontal theories which still have innovation at their heart, and particularly concerns around potential ecosystem effects of kind of how the impact of kind of adding an extra component to an existing platform, the circumstances where that's problematic. So I think it would be really interesting for us and everyone in the room to hear how DG Comp is navigating those issues. And when it comes to ecosystem theories in particular, how you're going about evaluating them, what are the trade-offs, and how you kind of reach a decision as to whether there's concerns or not.
Okay, I'll try in the next 10 minutes. I think there are several questions that you highlight. There's this whole discussion around ecosystems. So I like to take first to give you some perspective on how I see the concept at least being applied in our practice, and then how to navigate the issues about tech mergers in our latest practice, and maybe give also some perspective on the differences that we've seen. Whether it's an exhaustive framework, I'm not sure, but at least try to a bit contrast some of the outcomes that we had in different tech cases. So first on the ecosystems notion, or the ecosystem theory of harm, you said. I think it's important to clarify what we mean by that, because sometimes I hear that as a very distinct theory of harm, meaning ecosystems is a very different animal. And I think we've said it earlier or in other instances, but if you take a step back on that concept, essentially what happened in the antitrust Android case is that the court gave us some perspective on the fact that the Commission should look at the different markets and services that digital player, digital platform might offer or might be present in, but it's very important to keep track of the fact that these markets are very often interconnected, and you need to have an understanding, they say a multi-level or a multi-directional examination of these services. So essentially what the court told us, and what we've done in Android in an antitrust case, is to say, well, obviously you have to take into account that market context in order to understand the impact, the incentive, the potential strategies that you see in a case. And that's very important, and I think it's as important in antitrust as it is in mergers. And therefore, when we talk about merger control, for a very long time we've said, well, non-horizontal mergers at a time where we were only focusing on horizontal mergers are very important to scrutinize, in particular in those markets where you have very complementary services, where the outcome can be positive or negative. And obviously that happens to be the case in tech markets. And as a lawyer, it's very important to remind everyone about that, that very strong interconnection, that potential ecosystem reality, because we come from a very, there was a very old case law, the famous Tetra case law about non-horizontal mergers, that makes it very difficult, allegedly, for a competition enforcer in the EU to challenge or to block a non-horizontal merger, because allegedly, the chain of cause of effect may be deemed discernible. That is speculation. There's a lot of evidence being required. That was back in the early 2000s. Obviously, when you come into a market reality where markets are indeed very connected, services are very connected, well, you need to take that into account. First, to understand whether, how these markets interconnect, but what the potential impact of this is. And so, obviously in tech markets and in potentially other markets, I hope I can talk about that, we have to be super vigilant. So the ecosystem is not kind of a new theory that happened to be relied on in Booking e-Treveli. It's a market reality that we take into account when we assess a non-horizontal merger in tech, whether to assess whether there would be, potential threat being eliminated, a reverse killer acquisition, whether there would be a potential for foreclosure, a leveraging strategy, what would be the incentive, would it make sense in that whole ecosystem or not from a wider perspective. And it happened to also that in a context like booking, we had to look at whether in an ecosystem, the connected trip ecosystem, as it was called, whether the acquisition of the target, and we thought a special target, had the potential to strengthen the core market, entrench the core market position of the dominant player, booking, in a context that took place around an ecosystem. I think that clarifies, hopefully, what we mean by ecosystem, but I'm sure there will be discussions for the years to come. At least that's what the court told us in Android, and I'm very familiar with the Android case, and I thought that it was very important to take that back in the context of merger control. And actually, the special advisors that produced a report in 2019 for Commissioner Vestager also emphasized the need to look at that dimension and the potential strengthening of a core market position and a dominant position in particular. So I think that's the context, and I hope maybe it clarifies the position we have. Now, the second point is how do we navigate these issues? And then, if we have time, I can be exhaustive or try to be exhaustive, but I think in broad terms, what we essentially see in practice, and sorry to simplify, is that on the one hand, you have, acquisition mergers that essentially rely on a more offensive strategy where, there's an acquisition of a target by an important player in order to leverage that position in an adjacent market. Is that problematic or not? Traditionally, you look at whether it forecloses rivals or not. That sounds very familiar to everyone, and it should be, because that remains the core focus of our investigations in non-horizontal mergers, be them tech or non-tech. And I think that's the very important role for competition enforcers. That may take place in an ecosystem, and therefore you have to take into account these network effects, these interconnections or not outside ecosystems, or when there are no ecosystems. And the second maybe broad category of cases are those cases which are more defensive, where I think one could consider the type of cases that Florian has evoked, essentially acquisitions that have the impact of protecting a core market, either by removing a threat or by acquiring essential assets, being data, being customers, traffic, in order to strengthen or protect or entrench this core market position. Obviously, if the acquiring firm is a dominant firm, well, we are particularly vigilant, so don't be surprised that cases like booking is a case about a company that we have considered dominant after a long investigation where we reconstructed the market through a very wide investigation with thousands of hotels being asked to give a position. So we've reconstructed the market position, and to our surprise, it was much higher than what we had been told. Obviously, it's not the end of the story, it's the start of the story, just to be clear. But then we had to go into digging and understanding how the flight OTA service connect with the hotel OTA market. Are there network effects in the hotel OTA market? There are strong network effects. The more hotels you have, the more customers, and vice versa. And another important aspect was that we found that there was a lot of customer inertia. It's not pejorative, but we see that, we saw that in Android, for example, where you see that, customers tend to stay within the platform, maybe because they are satisfied, but they remain in the platform. They don't necessarily multi-home. They don't make a choice. And therefore, there's this kind of what I call, or what some business, it's a business term, called the kind of flywheel effect. The flywheel effect, meaning that, you don't need to do too much. The flywheel keeps spinning and grows, and you don't need to do too much, because once people are in, they don't get out. It's a simplified way. I can tell you the decision is much more motivated, but essentially to give you a highlight about one of these issues. It can be controversial, and I welcome that. We'll be in court. I think it's very important to bring these cases to court. Maybe it's untested, But I think the facts warrant that type of review and that type of discussion. And I'm surprised that sometimes I hear that it's very new to consider that a dominant company could strengthen its dominant position by acquiring a target. I mean, I find that a bit surreal, and maybe we should have thought of that in other cases, maybe 15 years ago. But that's the type of discussion, which leads me to that very technical but very important discussion about, are we departing from foreclosure? Are we inventing something that shouldn't exist at all? And again, I find that a bit ironic. Obviously, our non-horizontal guidelines focus on foreclosure, explicitly say that the main concern that one should have in a vertical or non-horizontal merger is about the potential for foreclosing rivals. That's the main issue. We agree. It's not the only issue. Actually, the guidelines themselves mention access to sensitive information as a potential deterrent for rivals to come in. And we tested this theory in energy cases and in other cases where indeed a vertical merger can have a deterrent effect on rivals because it gives access to very sensitive information. And you know that in the in energy market where you have this curve, it can give you very important information. So access to information is not about foreclosure. It's in our guidelines. Potential competition is not about foreclosure. It's a horizontal effect of any non-horizontal merger. So I don't really see the discussion of why it shouldn't be considered as a potential threat to competition because it's not about foreclosure. And think about aggregating data assets in a non-horizontal merger. We looked at that in Google Fitbit. We were criticized for many reasons, but that was the core of the issue. Was it strengthening or not the core market position of Google? Some may say yes, others no. So we had to find a solution to that. You could think of Booking. Is the acquisition of important traffic that is important as an entry point to the market, has it the potential to entrench or strengthen a dominant position? That's another example of a non-foreclosure theory of harm that may have a real impact. So I think we shouldn't, I'm sorry to say, but I think it's very important to be predictable, to have theories of harm that are well articulated, but we shouldn't put all of this in a very closed box where we're not able, when the facts tell us that we should be concerned, not to bring them. And that's exactly what I think we've been doing, be it in tech or in biotech. Illumina is one of them. And other cases, obviously, that maybe I will mention later. A third point, if I still have time, what is important is that what really matters also for practitioners or for those that who comment on our decisions is to keep a sense of perspective on what we do when we intervene. We don't jump up and down every time we see a tech case. There are cases which raise an issue like Booking. We had a discussion on Microsoft and an issue. And there were cases at the very same time that didn't raise an issue. And we looked at the ecosystem impact or not. Amazon MGM is a very good example. We looked at Google Photomath, in parallel to Booking a Travel. And we didn't find these features that, would lead to concerns. And I think for us, as the European Commission, it's very important to keep that objectivity, that credibility. People can agree or disagree on the theory of harms, or theories of harm that we apply, but we try to keep a sense of objectivity and motivation. First, because we want to win our cases in court. We think it's very important. And we're ready to bring untested issues when we think that the facts are right. But on the other hand, when a case for us deserves to be cleared or deserves remedies, we want to be serious about that, and we do that. And I think it's as important as blocking cases that deserve to be blocked.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask just one follow-up there, which coming to the distinction between foreclosure and sort of strengthening of a dominant position, that, as economists, we sort of tend to think of bringing together complements. You have a sort of raising rivals cost effect, a kind of effect that builds barriers to entry, but also potentially a kind of synergy efficiency from kind of integrating complements. So is it fair to say, I mean, I suppose the skeptic might say, well, if you're a dominant firm already, any sort of efficiency or synergy gets pointed to as a source of an additional entry barrier due to the transaction. So is there scope within this framework to trade off benefits and costs? And was the concern in Booking that you didn't think that the value was going to be shared with the consumer? Or is it more just a view that from a policy perspective, if something's strengthening a dominant position, that's a problem, even if there are some efficiencies?
So, I mean, it's a very difficult question, obviously. But the easy answer is on one aspect that, we want to be clear about. It's not a case where we don't have an FX-based approach. We have an FX-based approach, and we want to be right about the harm to the two sides of the platform, on the hotels in particular, and how that harm can be assessed. And obviously, we saw harm happening on the core market because we also, we already saw some features of a dominant position in terms of higher level of commissions, contract terms, and so on. And obviously, the risk that we want to avoid is those terms and those prices going up, so detrimental effects on hotels and consumers indirectly. And therefore, for us, the question is a question of competitive harm. The question as to whether, oh God, it allows some consumers to have, it's convenient to only in one platform. Is it a trade-off as such? First, it would have to be invoked as a pure efficiency. I don't remember it was the case. But I think it goes beyond that. The question is really, the long-term harm that you may have and that you see versus something that may happen. But the question in this case is not about any acquisition being harmful. It's the acquisition of a particular player. So there's a particular capability, particular market position of that target, number 2 at the time, I think number 1 by now, specific technological assets. So I think we are careful, to qualify what we do. It's not any acquisition that would necessarily be problematic, but in that particular case, we saw that the significant impact on the businesses and consumers would, in our view, be detrimental to competition.
Cool. Thank you very much. So I think this tees things up, I think, well for Marshall, because I think what would be great to get from you as as a researcher on platforms, what sort of advice you'd give to enforcers like Sarah, Guillaume, and Michael when they're navigating issues around integrating complements into platforms. I think the question I've just given Guillaume is perhaps a really core one of how you trade off the potential kind of moat building barriers to entry effect against potential efficiencies. And I think the last thing is I've seen that you've got about 20 slides to get through, so I'm going to wish you good luck, and let's see how we go.
To make this swift, I want to say I've been very impressed with this, Ali, that you've actually got really not to study M&A, but you're good at it. You've acquired a big enough audience, the other conferences aren't competitive anymore. So really bringing this along. So Ali's actually asked me to give a couple of theories on how platforms operate. So I really want to see if I can just preface this with 3. One is looking at platforms or ecosystems as inverted firms. I think this helps to explain a lot of the difficulties we have in assessing platforms and project how we can deal with them. A second is some solutions on in situ data rights as a way to go after this. And the third, I think, is something novel for this audience. It's an end-to-end theory borrowed from computer science. And it's an incredibly powerful idea that needs attention brought from computer science into economics and into law. So with that, let me see if I can visit just a couple of different questions. I want to reframe the debate slightly, because I think a lot of what we've heard today is often for the DMA and the DSA. The question is often how we create competition in fair, contestable markets. And I like to reframe that question as one is how do we create wealth and then divide it? Because all too often I think the interventions from traditional antitrust prevent wealth creation even as they succeed at solving some of the value distribution problems. So how are we going to solve the innovation question surrounding that? So if we look at some of the problems that we face in traditional antitrust, one of the first is market share dominance. Is Amazon in books, cloud, e-commerce, publishing, health? Is Alibaba in cloud, payments, banking, logistics, movies? Is Google in search, maps, self-driving cars, or devices? These boundaries are really hard to define in some of these industries. Or take our most basic tests. If you move from a competitive market to oligopolistic or duopoly or monopoly, what typically happens is you're restricting output to raise prices. But Facebook isn't restricting your posts, Amazon isn't restricting your purchases, Google isn't restricting your searches. So what's happening there? We heard also today the questions about prices. So you could have above marginal cost pricing, the small but significant increase in prices to demonstrate market power, or it might be below marginal cost for predation. But in these markets, the price is often zero as the profit maximizing price. So what's going on? I'd like to assert that almost all of these cases, it really is the network effects or externalities we heard a moment ago from Gibbons and others. I don't really need to articulate externality or network effects for this audience, but I want to highlight one idea, which is to move in the direction of externalities from network effects. So if you think of a native interaction that's taking place here is the blue line. One person's search, purchase, treatment, view, or experience that makes another person's search, purchase, view, or experience better. It's the gold lines that the platform then orchestrates. So you're creating a positive externality. You're creating extra benefit that's not present in the original interaction. And my assertion is that requires orchestration. That requires governance. In this sense, platforms are not markets and they're not hierarchies. They're not vertically integrated firms. And they're not markets because they're doing orchestration of positive externalities that you do not see in standard markets. This has some fairly big implications. The first of these is that I would actually claim platforms are better understood as inverted firms. And what do I mean by that? If you're going to scale network effects, where are you going to do it? Inside the firm or outside the firm? Well, it should be obvious it's much easier to scale network effects outside the firm, to get the flywheel going when there are more resources outside the firm than inside the firm. What this means is the creation of value often happens outside the firm, not inside. It's users creating value for other users, whether they're intentionally doing it or not, using machine learning algorithms to make one interaction better based on another interaction. This incidentally explains why platforms have such high market value, but so few assets and so few employees. Production is happening outside. So if we quickly revisit our tests, market share dominance, well, it's easier to explain if you have an inverted firm when third parties are producing the apps, the devices, the books, and the merchant sales. Or if it's third parties that are producing the assets, then the platform is experiencing zero marginal cost production. So of course it makes no sense to restrict output when each and every transaction brings you incremental revenue. So you don't want to restrict output, you want as much as possible in that case. And of course, this audience clearly recognizes that two-sided profit, two-sided markets is profit maximizing with a price of zero, which can be devastating on competition. So concepts of these inverted firms help to explain a lot of what's going on. So what can we do with this? So here are three possibilities or different ways of viewing the problem. The first is these kind of fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory access. Another is going to be a new kind of data right. Another is going to be this end-to-end principle from computer science. So we heard earlier this wonderful observation that Apple is discriminating against other parties in terms of ability to get access to data. Or Google is doing it with the removal of the cookies. It's interesting that the DMA is what I would say positively schizophrenic with respect to its data policies. Article 6.2 says Amazon cannot use the data, and yet there are other articles that say it must share that data. Well, suppose that we did something else, which we separate the apps on top from the infrastructure on the bottom. We use that then to create a legal and technical firewall so that access to underlying data and services are then separated via APIs, very standard computer technology, and the specifications for access are published and open to anyone. Then third parties can actually buy access to the data and services underneath in the infrastructure under the exact same terms as the original firm. If we do that, what happens? We get fair and efficient competitive entry. We get multiple parties actually using the same non-rival information resource. We're paying for the infrastructure. One of the things I heard earlier this morning was this Exegit and Eight's discussion of the declining business dynamism. Here, This guarantees knowledge diffusion because more parties gain access to the information. So it's another possible mechanism for dealing with this. The second one, I'd like to offer a critique of GDPR and some of the standard data portability arguments. If you look at these two-sided markets, here might be producers and consumers, each interacting with the other, and you're given the right to port out your data. But now think about your post relative to a friend's post, or your data relative to a merchant's data. The only thing you can take is your data. If someone else posts about you or tags you, you can't download that. That's not your data, that's their data. So the first thing that happens is you pull it out, you lose context. Suppose we propose alternatively that you gain the right to pull an algorithm from any location into the infrastructure where it is resident. In that case, what would happen is you gain visibility, you gain context for all of the different things that you're being shown, all of that different data. That then has several different benefits. If you look at data portability, you've lost the context. There's actually some nice research where folks tried to download their Facebook data, and it was almost impossible to get that stuff out and make it useful form. It stagnates if you pull it out. This has been they tried to remedy this in the DMA by making it continuous or real time as one way to do it. This, however, is still impotent because you can't use it to make a purchase or receive a benefit on platform. One thing we heard from this morning, the Director General, there's an information asymmetry problem. How are the monitors going to keep track of whether they're misbehaving or not, especially if you take stuff out of the infrastructure? By contrast, we can flip all of those. If it's the case you gain the right to import your preferred algorithm, your choice, to your data and infrastructure, then what happens? All context is preserved. It's completely fresh because it's the current data. It's potent because you can use it within the infrastructure, and you can monitor what they're actually showing you and what they're doing to you. So Google might be able to keep an eye on Facebook. Facebook could keep an eye on Amazon. Competitors can keep an eye on each other at your invitation as user. This also has a benefit for M&A. Why would firms buy other firms regarding data? One of the first reasons to do that is to gain access to their data. If users had an in situ data right, you wouldn't have to buy the firm. You simply reward the users for gaining access to their account. So you don't have to buy the firm anymore. Now let's flip it. What's the other reason they might buy data? Well, now you want to keep it away from a competitor, so it's a data foreclosure. But that doesn't work anymore with in situ data rights. Then your competitors can gain access to that data by rewarding your customers. We're getting more of that data diffusion again that we didn't see previously. Again, knowledge diffusion rises in this context. Consider what actually happens. Another thing I heard from Rita today was wonderful, that the vast amount of ad surplus is going to whom? Facebook and Google. If I recall correctly, it was 30% of the online ad market here in Europe. Well, it's pretty obvious who captures the ad surplus now. If you're using a Victory auction, what happens? Well, the surplus, you place the bids. In this case, the surplus is being captured by the platform at the center. Now, let's suppose you gain an in situ data right, and you gain the capability to invite Google to show you ads on your Facebook infrastructure. What happens? The only reason you're going to do that is if Google is willing to share some of their ad revenue with you. But Facebook then wants to say, well, holy cow, I don't want Google to show you ads on your Facebook infrastructure. I'll share some of my ad revenue with you, in which case Google ups its bid and then Facebook ups its bid. What we then get is the platforms competing with each other because you become the bottleneck, not the platform. Once that happens, surplus is transferred to the consumer as part of the competitive process without having to intervene by government. So it's another way of dealing with this. The user as the bottleneck gets to collect the user data rents in this case, and the infrastructure allows you to create the value on top of it. Okay? It also allows the dynamic innovation. So if your algorithm is better, you get to keep the extra surplus created by your algorithm relative to the competition. It helps to introduce this innovation capacity. The last idea I want to give you is this one from computer science. And this is called the end-to-end principle, and it's an incredibly powerful idea. It is the idea on which the internet is based. So let me demonstrate this for you with a couple of device observations. Imagine these three different individuals each have these three different devices, complete with these different functions, the plus, the cloud, the star, and the hexagonal functions in here. You can replace any device really easy, they're disconnected, but this particular system is problematic for two reasons. The first of these is each has a separate protocol so that the security in an Internet of Things environment is extremely difficult and extremely challenging. So a hacker could break into any one. The second element of it is you don't get the efficiencies in here. There are three shared hexagonal functions, and so you replace all of those if you replace any one of them. Another alternative is this monolithic system where security is really good. Everything is one unit, and it's really easy to protect. You've also got the efficiency of scale on the hexagonal function that everyone is sharing. But now we don't get innovation, because if you want to replace a component, you're replacing the whole bloody thing. The proper way to handle this under the end-to-end principle is to create an efficiency where the high-frequency, low-variety features go into the core. That's the platform. Low-frequency, high-variety features go into the edges. That's the app layer. What's happening on the internet? You don't care if a packet is finance or video or audio or any of those. It just doesn't matter. What does it do? It's store and forward, store and forward. You don't have to check, but you do care if you're a financial app. You can't afford to drop a bit. You could drop a bit in voice internet protocol because you don't care. That's checked at the app layer. You wouldn't want to put all of that inefficiency in the core because you want to check for it's a finance or video or another kind of voice application at the core. That's inefficient. This lets you gain the efficiencies of adaptation, give you the security, and other elements of it. This is how the internet is built, and this is how platforms can and should be built, and it then has really interesting implications for merger control and merger and acquisition. So if we take a look at it in the following way, when is M&A bad? When is it good? Well, we just heard wonderful presentations on killer acquisitions. So if you are foreclosing innovation either by third parties or yourself, those acquisitions are not in society's best interest. Or if we have, similarly, if we have anti-competitive acquisitions, even if it's not stuff in your own environment, you may be shutting down competition among other ecosystem players in your environment as you take over and try to seek those particular profits. But what if the same function or feature is needed in multiple places? By this end-to-end principle, imagine that the blue boxes are showing up in multiple places. Then it does make sense to absorb that, merge that, into the core. This is a particular feature that is a complement, not just to the core, but it is a complement to the other apps in the environment. In this context, a great example is voice command, voice control. It makes no sense for every app to develop its own protocol for voice control. That's vastly too expensive. It makes far more sense for the platform to absorb that, make it available to all different apps and functions, and gain the efficiencies. So the end-to-end principle will be a useful discriminant between what's a good acquisition and what's a bad one in terms of gaining certain efficiencies in the process as a whole. So I wanted to argue that the issue is creating value and setting up the competition to divide it fairly. I wanted to give you three ideas for doing just that. One of those is inverted firms, where the production is created outside. The second is this in situ data rights, together with some of the FRAND access that I articulated a moment ago, where users gain the right to import the algorithm of their choice into the infrastructure where their data is resident. And the third is this end-to-end principle from computer science. So I think all of those are really, really useful ways to see that. Now, Ali promised me I would gain, if I had extra time, and I actually kept it under 20 minutes. He gave me one other slide. I had one other idea. It's a different, so I don't want to sidetrack the current conversation. But I personally think that the platforms and misinformation problem is one of the most important problems today. So I don't want to sidetrack our conversation about acquisitions, mergers, and other things. But if you're interested in this question, I think there are ways to reduce misinformation with no censorship and with no central authority judging truth. So if you're interested in that, please talk to me afterwards. Other than that, I'm very happy to talk, let's even go backwards again. back to this particular issue. So I thank you.
Thank you very much.
18 minutes.
Yeah, 18 minutes. Well done. You're a superstar. I think if anyone had 6 shared hexagonal functions on their bingo card, then you win. But I think it's a really fascinating question, really, about almost market design. No? How you can kind of, as you say, create value and share value. And I wanted to come to your slide towards the end, talking about the implications for mergers, where, as I understand it, the logic of what you're saying is if it's a platform buying something that builds up the core, then that's kind of value that can kind of be used by multiple different complements and get shared in multiple different places, and that's a good thing. How does that sort of dovetail? Like, is that a sort of pessimistic view of saying, like, these platforms are never going to be disrupted, so therefore anything that builds them up and gets shared, that's a good thing? Like, how do we kind of trade off the idea that building up the core actually entrenches the platform and makes it harder to displace? And then second, on the flip side of what you said, that the sort of, as I understood it, the acquisition of an application or a complement, that's, in your view, more problematic. Is that sort of heavily reliant on this idea that you can get all of the efficiency through these sorts of structures and APIs and so on and so forth? And if that's not the case, does there become a value potentially from a platform buying an application? I think there's a little button.
Let me answer those in reverse order. So we did some economic modeling. The math was actually on the slides you told me not to include. So that we can actually show that you get very different behavior if competition is occurring on the top, the platform layer, versus competition is occurring at the bottom layer. If the competition is occurring on the top layer, the platform loses its interest in subsidizing or opening the downstream because they're not able to participate in the value that is no longer being captured. And so you get bad behavior. On the other hand, if the competition occurs at the platform layer, this seems very much like the Figma versus Adobe case. That's competition on the platform layer. Then they're motivated to open and try to get as many developers on board as possible to compete with the other platforms. So you stimulate innovation. So depending on if you're competitive at the top layer or the bottom layer, you get very different behaviors. So focus on which layer we're on. In answer to your second question, the discriminant, I would fall back on this, again, this original article by Reed, Salzer, and Clark from 1981 on this. And it's really, the rule is the high-frequency, low-variety use cases go into the platform. The high-variety, low-frequency use cases go in the apps. And that's the discriminant. And it's a pretty good indicator. Again, if you fall back on the different kinds of packets shared or switched on the internet, those are useful indications. Of course, there's a spectrum between those two ends, but that gives you, I think, the correct intuition.
Cool, thank you very much. So I'd now like to come back to Sarah. So we've had a quite wide-ranging discussion, but it'd be great to get your reactions. I think a couple of points that jump out to me would be coming back to the Activision case, where that seemed to have a bit of a flavor of these ecosystem concerns, because ultimately part of the source of the issue was that Microsoft had these multiple different components that were being kind of potentially woven together to give it an advantage in cloud gaming, and how you thought about the trade-offs there. And then two, there's a question around perhaps the role of kind of structural remedies and behavioral remedies in light of some of Marshall's discussion about how we can kind of get value and share it. So, but also interested in any other general reactions you might have.
I was really hoping I could offer a perspective on the end-to-end computer science view of merge control. Look, I mean, I think it's more seriously, it's a really fascinating discussion, and actually for me, the kind of common thread through all of the comments from the panelists so far, and I say this very much from the perspective ultimately of an enforcer who has to sit down at the end of the day and look at the commercial reality of the deals that we're assessing, is that we've got to ground our assessment in that commercial reality. We've got to get under the skin of the markets that we're looking at, the way competition is working in those markets, the way the players are operating, and the impact of that merger. And that sounds like merger control 101, but sometimes I find myself in discussions where it can get quite abstract and it can get quite theoretical, and I understand why that happens. But at the end of the day, for us as enforcers, we've got to bring it back to the reality of what we see before us, and we've got to bring it back to the reality of, not to stray too much into a broader debate for this session about platforms and competition concerns, but a reality of the concerns, actual and potential, that we see where you see this aggregation of market power across some of these digital platforms. So, I find this in a way quite a simple and quite a straightforward discussion, because I think it reflects very much the approach that we've taken in the UK over the last few years. I touched in my opening speech on the update that we undertook back in 2021 when we updated our merger assessment guidance. And that brings out a lot of the themes that we've discussed today. Florian's points around not getting too caught up in market definition is absolutely critical with these markets. Now, of course, that provides a helpful kind of analytical checkpoint, but it cannot be the central construct through which we have to look at the assessment of competition concerns, because it just doesn't lift and shift well into a number of these markets and the kind of concerns that we're seeing. It's really important that we look at issues like the deal value, which, again, in and of itself, don't give a straight yes or no answer as to whether there's a problem. But it's a clear indicator to us as enforcers of, is this something that we should be probing? We should be understanding better what's driving this deal beyond any sort of immediate value in the target as an independent competing entity. It's incredibly important that we're looking at the dynamic nature of competition, and I won't repeat everything that Florian and Guillaume have said. And it's also really important, I think, that we don't get too hung up on labels, whether that's the label of killer acquisitions or the label of ecosystem theories of harm. It's got to come back to the fundamentals of what are the competition concerns, the potential competition concerns here. How do we best get under the skin of those, and how do we best then use economics, use evidence, use sensible analytical frameworks to take reasonable, rational judgments at the end of the day, where we are doing our job as enforcers to make sure that we are protecting these markets in a way that keeps competition open, that enables innovation to flourish, that enables competitive innovation to flourish, because of course, sometimes we see innovation building the moats and entrenching the market position, and avoids deals that stifle or prevent future innovation. So that's at the heart of what we're doing, and I think that's at the heart of this discussion. And I think what you're hearing today is the perspective of the enforcer, the perspective of the economist or the academic, all getting to the heart of the same issues. But I do think it's important to kind of come back to ultimately how we have to take our decisions as enforcers. So that's my sort of slightly long-winded reflection on the discussion. In response, Ollie, to your question on Microsoft and ecosystem theories of harm. So, I think, I would echo Guillaume's comment, really. I think we have tended to try to avoid the label of sort of ecosystem theories of harm, because I think it can be sort of dangerous when you get into those labels. But I would endorse every single point that Guillaume made about the sort of analytical framework for looking at concerns. In the Microsoft Activision case, what we ended up with essentially was, in many ways a fairly traditional vertical foreclosure set of concerns, but in the context of a market where you had Microsoft that already had that sort of multi-product position of market power, so a position across cloud, across Xbox, across Windows in terms of operating systems, and therefore we're looking at the impact of the acquisition of Activision in that context across that, call it an ecosystem, but across that kind of agglomeration of market power, recognizing in that case a significant market position also being held by Activision, and then how that was going to play through into the emerging market of cloud gaming. So I think it was a fairly conventional analytical framework actually applied to that particular sort of set of market dynamics. And as I say, I think you've seen that at play in a number of other cases that we've taken forward. Excuse me, I'm a very croaky throat today. But and just sort of picking up actually one of Florian's points, so I won't go into detail on the Adobe case either, because obviously that's a live case for us too. But I think you captured, very well the way that both we in the UK and well, I won't speak for Guillaume, but certainly capturing the way that we're looking at the issues too. Where does that leave us? I think it's really important that we make sure that we continue to be agile in the way that we're looking at these issues. I think the risk for us as enforcers is we're accused of creating too much uncertainty or unpredictability in our approach, and I think there are two elements to that. One is, I touched on this earlier, where we're looking at these markets which are dynamic and are fast-moving, and where inevitably we're having to do that sort of forward-looking judgment call, not crystal ball gazing, I would say, but judgment calls on sort of future developments. Of course, there's a degree of future anticipation involved in that, but it's very much grounded in the evidence and the analysis that we see. It's not sort of speculative in that sense, but it does come with a degree of uncertainty, and it's our responsibility as enforcers to take those judgment calls, and obviously, of course, they're ultimately reviewed by the courts. So that's sort of one part of it. And then the second part of it is that we absolutely must continue to evolve the way that we assess these mergers in a way that keeps up with the nature of competition and of commercial practice in those markets. And I don't think that creates excess uncertainty in terms of enforcement, because you actually see a very consistent pattern of analysis, and you see that coming through our cases, you see it coming through the cases in the European Commission, you see it coming through the commentary from academics. So actually, I think there's an incredible consistency in the way that we're looking at these issues. It's evolving, but it's not unpredictable, I would say.
I don't know if we can jump in and comment. Because I actually want to just defend something Guillaume said, because I actually liked some of the ecosystem theories. So whether one calls them ecosystem theories or not, I do think markets with externalities behave differently than markets without externalities. So whether one calls them ecosystem theories or not, externalities guarantee a certain kind of market failure that requires some restructuring, either in a Pigovian sense or a Coasian sense. So I think it's really important to address differences between markets that do and do not have externalities.
Very good. So to come to you, Michael, we've not had much of a chance yet to bring you into the discussion. So earlier in the day, you were talking about the sort of challenges as enforcers in the US with the kind of traditional theories and the courts being skeptical even on kind of traditional theories where there's an evidence base that's quite well established. It seems to me as an outsider from this side of the Atlantic looking at the merger guidelines that very much in sync with some of the concerns which have been articulated by the other panelists, but perhaps face a bigger challenge to bring them in front of the court. So just be very interested to get your reactions from the US perspective as to the stuff we've heard on the panel so far.
I mean, we do have 2 Section 2 cases against this small mom and pop company that you may have heard of, Google. And I think those theories actually do really embrace a lot of what's been talked about here. So I think, right, our view of the world is our job is to bring the cases we're supposed to bring. And, the judges, you get the draw on the judge and you move on. And so, I don't know. I feel like I'm not answering your question, because, but maybe.
And any other reactions in terms of, perhaps the role you see for economics versus other sources of evidence, or how you're weighing up some of these trade-offs?
Good. So, I guess I should say, I think I largely agree with the other panelists. I mean, in some sense, when you talk about, I think one thing, it's always important with antitrust law is whatever the new industry is, there's about 20 years of everything's different and you have to look at this entirely differently. And then after 20 years, it's like, oh, yeah, no, you just apply the same principles. But I mean, I really like the way Sarah described it. And so to sort of just plagiarize here a little bit, you know, one of the things I think what government enforcers really need to do in cases is how does the market work? How does the conduct or the merger change it? And what's the result? And that those should be your basic questions. And you can get to market definition later, you get to efficiencies later, you get to all the other legal requirements. But by creating rules, there's a tendency to want to immediately go, well, what's the market? Well, the market, and then we can't prove this market. Well, okay. But like, we really should be concerned about, do we think competition's going to be harmed? And, you know, maybe it creates a market problem. Maybe we think at the end we can't bring the case because of that. But it is, and just as sort of as an example, in a way, in a market that's entirely not interesting at all, doesn't have all these network effects, but that actually, I think, still understanding the ecosystem is important. Is when I was at the FTC, we challenged, it was a company, an acquisition involving Graco. They basically make the equipment, right, that offices, that companies use, factories use to sort of paint, right? So like, you know, when you're painting your shelves in your factory, you're not, you know, you don't want expensive paint that's, you know, you're not there to match it. You just like, right, you want gray, you got to do a lot of it fast, and there are all these different equipment. Right, so the investigation started with staff would be talking to the people, the sellers, the retailers. So, you know, if the price of this spray gun, you know, increased, what would you do? And they're like, I'd pay it. And then you know, so would you consider switching, right? And they were like, no. And at some point, I'd like to say it was me, but it was not. Somebody realized that the way these guys are the way the dealers were competing was on the line. That you wouldn't mix and match. You were either a Graco dealer or, now I'm, you know, old, so I can't remember, or the other company dealer. And once you started asking them about what happens if you if one of these two go away, all of a sudden we got these very sophisticated answers that fit an antitrust case. Like, well, you know, I'm going to start losing. It's going to be that or nothing. And, you know, telling a competitive story about how they even played them off against each other. And again, it's not nearly as complicated as the examples we've been talking about, but it is. But the basic point is, you know, even in traditional industries, we have to think about how competition works and what the ecosystem looks like.
Very good, thank you. So I think now coming towards the end, I think it's good to give people a bit of a respite from digital and tech, and maybe come back to Guillaume and just get your take on the Hutchison judgment. And you know, we've obviously had a big year, not just in digital and tech, but also more clarity about how to evaluate gap cases and kind of the more traditional mergers in oligopolistic markets. And it would be just interesting to get your views on what that judgment means for the EC's approach to mergers going forward. Is it steady as she goes, or does it have implications really for how you're going to be evaluating cases going forward?
Thank you for your question. I'm mindful of time, so I'll try to be quick. I think there's a specific question on the impact of the Hutchison judgment. That's one, but going beyond that, it's you know, the implication on deals beyond tech. And that's very important as far as we are concerned as well. So I think on the CK Telecom judgment, there's been a lot of comments. But if I summarize, I think the judgment is important because it brings clarity once and for all on the standard of proof that one needs to apply in merger control in the EU, whether in horizontal cases involving gap cases, so where there's no dominance, but beyond, because the court is very clear that irrespective of the complexity of the theory of harm, the standard of proof should be one of balance of probabilities. So that's one topic that is very important, because in fact the real discussion when we discuss, for example, tech mergers or complex theories of harm or new theories of harm, and also horizontal mergers, is more the type of evidence one needs to bring to show that probability, that likelihood. I think that's the real discussion. But for us, it's very comforting that we have to show that it's likely, not it's very likely, whatever the merger is about. There are many other important aspects in that judgment about the notion of closeness of competition, notion of important competitive constraint, the burden of proof on efficiencies. I mean, very basic stuff, frankly. So 20 years after the reform of merger control, it was about time, but at least we got some clarity at the highest level, which is very welcome, and I think it will have implications, obviously, in all kinds of cases, not only basic horizontal mergers. But which brings me to the real question for me, is that there's a lot of discussion around tech mergers. It's very intellectually stimulating. It is very important economically, but obviously it shouldn't be a pretext not to do what is our bread and butter, dealing with horizontal mergers in very concentrated markets, in traditional industries. And that's taking place against the backdrop of many papers by the IMF, by the OECD, by many academics saying, well, yes, competition drives innovation, drives investment, drives consumer welfare, drives competitiveness, because that's a word that we hear a lot. And indeed, it drives competitiveness in many respects. We could discuss that. And I think it's very important. We're looking at cases in air transport, telecoms, construction, building equipment, things that matter for everyday people, where you can have a direct impact on consumers. And needless to say that we're not forgetting these cases. If you look at our track record, most of our interventions are on horizontal mergers, be there mergers involving dominance or mergers not involving dominance. And I think that's very important as competition enforcers, as competition practitioners as well, to remind everyone. And I think Michael made that reference in his speech to, that is something that matters, and matters a lot at a time where, there might be different perspectives on these industries. And obviously we've, well, I don't want to go through all the cases we've looked at, but there were many important cases last year, including in industries like rail equipment, like chemical industries. We had cases in telecom. We had cases, dealing with the gap cases in retail, the retail fuel sector, looking at coordinated effects also. And that, people don't get it. They don't discuss it. But we want to be as active as we are in tech. Testing some theories that allegedly are complex to apply. And we've done it, and we will continue to do that. So the second point I want to make is that on non-horizontal mergers, again, the focus is very much on tech, which we understand for the reasons we discussed, ecosystems, interconnected markets, and so on. And there are tech cases beyond platforms, pure technology cases. Some of them are ongoing. You mentioned some of them. I don't want to comment. But there are also non-horizontal cases in very traditional industries. So we had one, for example, in recycled aluminium, very important. We had concerns. These are markets where, the divestiture made a lot of sense, solved the concerns, but that is something that we are as vigilant as in tech. We had cases, a conglomerate case, a big case on consumer research, Advent, GfK, so Nielsen, where there was a divestiture of a global business. So these are very important cases that, don't get the media attention, but in practice, that is our bread and butter, and that will continue. And the third thing is about innovation that we were supposed to discuss, I think, today, but that's what Olivier said. But, I guess all of this is part of the innovation discussion, which is a challenge for every competition enforcer, for economists and so on. But that is also one of the main parameters of competition. We've always known it, but it's very difficult to quantify all the effects, to have a clear framework. And I think Florian made a reference to pharma, where indeed you have some very good proxies, and I think the notion of killer acquisition has gone beyond that now, and it's very welcome, but with different proxies. And when we talk about innovation, again, I think you know, it wasn't tech, it was biotech. Illumina is one of the very landmark cases we've brought up. It's in court now, but that is a quite fundamental issue. How do you preserve the race to innovate between rivals that are not yet on the market as a kind of commercialized, a known market, but they are racing. You don't know who is winning, who will win, and precisely that's the role of a competition enforcer, to preserve that uncertainty, to preserve that competition that is inherent to the innovation drive that you see in these markets. And I think we take a lot of, we have taken a lot of lessons from this case in other cases, in other industries. And I think one interesting aspect that we see in Europe, at least, I'm sure in the US as well, or in the UK, is the impact of, sustainability, green innovation, green disruption in very traditional industries. And I think what has been interesting for me personally in the last year or so is to see those cases where, you thought that they are well-established industry, but there's a newcomer coming, having a better technology for recycled aluminium, for any type of very essential input for competitiveness, by the way. And there you want to preserve that innovation, you want to preserve that disruption. And for me, therefore, the discussion is not so much how to get an exemption to get green, whatever sustainability, is precisely how to make sure that competition preserves that drive for innovation on greener products, greener supply chains, and so on. And I think that's, if you take a high-level view on that, I think that is important as tech mergers. I don't want to lower the importance of tech mergers, but one should not use that as a pretext not to deal with what matters for basic industries and citizens and our daily lives. So that's, I think, the point I wanted to make.
Very good. So I think one last topic I'd be keen to cover is this question of international divergence. And obviously the most notable example is Microsoft Activision, but there are also other instances where different agencies have come to different conclusions, whether that's due to different facts, different interpretations, but also maybe kind of deeper sort of philosophical issues, like for example, the issue of structural versus behavioral remedies. So I think it'd be really interesting, Sarah, Guillaume, and Michael, just to understand your view on what's driving these differences. Is there more that can be done to increase alignment, or do we even want to increase alignment? Is it better to have kind of independence people just come up with different decisions? That just is what it is. It would be great to get your views.
I mean, I'll be brief. I sort of slightly challenge the question in the sense that I think the starting point is actually a very high degree of alignment and convergence rather than divergence. And I think Microsoft is actually a very good example of that, because across the US, the UK and the EU, the substantive concerns were absolutely aligned. I think inevitably there will be cases where there are different outcomes. That's inevitable, where you have jurisdictions, where you have differences in the regime. We've talked a lot about some of the uncertainties inherent in some of the analysis. There will be cases, as you say, where there are differences in the evidence base. There are differences in the market dynamics. And there will be cases where ultimately, at the end of the day, there is a difference in the judgment call, taking all of the evidence that we see in the round. But I do believe those are the exception. And I think that is actually reflected in, if you look at the overall set of cases over recent times and on an ongoing basis. When it comes to remedies, again, I think actually far and away, the most part, there's a high degree of alignment. Again, each of us individually has to take our view at the end of the day about whether the remedies that are put forward, we think resolve our concerns in a way that meets our own legislative framework. That's what we did in the Microsoft case. But I really do think this sort of question of divergence is overstated.
Guillaume, would you like to take that one? Oh.
On the topic of international convergence, or I think indeed, I mean, first for me, what is important as competition enforcers and for businesses and generally is that at least we shouldn't aim at divergence. We should aim at convergence when we can. And that's very important. That's very important for the credibility of, these complex discussions we have on, how to frame the debate on substantive issues, on tech mergers, for example. So at least I think we all aim at converging when we can. Now, the question is on substance. Sometimes we diverge on substance because there are different market realities. Frankly, that's always been there. You have different market positions. You have different, if the markets are not global and so on. So that is unavoidable. We don't aim at making these differences, the main reality. And I don't think it's the case. Indeed, in most cases, there's alignment if there are, common features in the market. Now, on substance, you mentioned Microsoft Activision. Frankly, when we started this case, everyone was looking at consoles and so on. And I think we understood quite quickly, at least for the EU, that we were not there to protect the dominant or the leading player in consoles, which was not Microsoft. So we focused on let's say, the most narrow part of the market. It's not a market for us, it's more segment between, cloud gaming versus, consoles and PC. And we saw that indeed it was a nascent market. It was important to preserve that, that potential competition. And frankly, I think ultimately, we aligned. I think the CMA took the same approach to focus its investigation on cloud gaming. And then we had differences on remedies. Differences that we have sometimes, indeed. I mean, let's be clear that we think in some cases we can target the issue with non-structural remedies. It remains the exception, to be very clear. And these are cases where it's very targeted. It's like, an API issue. It's very focused. When it's broader, like, Booking, NVIDIA ARM, Illumina, we don't accept them. So there has been differences. At the end of the day, in Microsoft, we're not so far away. We had different type of licenses. One is, for Ubisoft, 15 years. We had a different approach, but I think hopefully we try to converge. So I think it's important for everyone. Everyone is conscious of that. I hope we'll, if there's a need to improve, we will. But we have very open discussions, and I think that's critical. That's critical.
Yeah. So again, Sarah, I agree that that there is a question. The premise of the question should be challenged, because I think even this panel, you're hearing very consistent things from all three of us. But it's worth thinking about this more generally, about divergence, where it does occur. And it's not really an antitrust question. It really goes to, your basic views of politics. We are all representing different sovereigns, and sometimes when companies complain about, they're upset about they have to have all different levels of review and different types of review, it's like, well, okay, but that's kind of a feature of having different sovereigns and having democracies, and people have different views. So I think we want to be very careful when we talk about divergence, what kind of divergence is, because I think all three of us would say our job is to enforce our laws, and that's what we do, and we make independent decisions. That said, it makes perfect sense for us to be communicating and talking and learning from each other, and I think oftentimes when that's done right, there's a lot of convergence, not because we're trying to converge, but because we are learning the same facts and applying very similar analyses. So I guess I'm trying to have it both ways to say, it's the divergence question is actually sort of assumes some responsibility amongst independent countries to prioritize convergence over enforcement, but at the same time, in reality, I think that I think there's a lot of convergence. I keep looking over at Paula because she represents California, also a sovereign, and so maybe it's because we have based on the way the United States system works, it's like, well, we have 53, 54, 55, well, I guess no, 51, because you would think I'd remember that. I live in the District of Columbia. You know, and so to the degree a state wants to do something different, or DOJ wants to do something different, or between the FTC and the states, that again is just a function of a political choice that's been made, and frankly, I think that's the right political choice anyway. So.
Cool. Conscious that we've got the commissioner waiting, so I think we should wrap this up. I just wanted to do a quick fire round. Imagine that we're all sat here at the Brussels conference 2028 in 5 years' time. What would you want to have seen? How would what would be a sign that things have developed well when we're coming back, that these policy shifts have worked effectively? What evidence we would like to see? What would be a sign of good outcomes? And I'll throw that open to anyone who wants to have a first stab.
I want to see some proper formalizations of these new theories of ecosystems harms. I think we've made great progress in terms of innovation theories. We've got great theories in terms of vertical relations, exclusions, raising rivals' cost, externalities. But I don't think we have a really good theory of the flywheel. I mean, people put the picture up and say it's the flywheel, but I haven't seen a formalization of it, and I think that's more a call to the economists to come up with proper theories on that. So I would hope that on that panel in 2028, somebody has already a fully formed out theory of that.
So I can take over. So for me, in 2028, you said, what would be great is that we have judgments in the cases we've been discussing, Illumina, bookings, and so on. And so we can discuss...
Antitrust is glacial, yeah.
Then we can discuss exactly whether, the framework was right, whether, it helps to assess other mergers, whether there's a flywheel effect, an ecosystem theory to hold or not. I think it's very important. I'm not joking. I think it's very important that we get clarity, legal certainty, in order to allow businesses, to make predictions on whether the mergers can go through or not, and for enforcers, to act consistently on these very important issues. If we have to wait until 2028, I think that would be regrettable.
I'll jump in with one idea. Yes, it would be nice to see if Figma Adobe is resolved by that time. But one possibility would be great to see in 2028 if some of the theories we put forward today are still useful in the age of AI. As technology pushes forward yet another frontier around intellectual property, around data, around the size of the firm, it would be really interesting to make sure that these theories still apply as technology moves forward.
Because I'm going to agree with you, I want you to go first.
Mine's very simple. I want to make sure that we haven't made major under-enforcement misses that we're talking about in 2028.
It's hard to disagree with that one. So it really depends on at what level. So let me start, it won't start at a smaller level to a broader level. And this should not surprise you if you manage to stay awake through the post-lunch speech. It would be really great if in 2028, enforcers in the United States, for example, did not have to convince judges that corporations maximize profits. And they do that whether it's, and so therefore if it's exclusionary, it's not a question about a company's DNA, it's whether it's profitable, right? It would be nice if we aren't caught in a trap of when we bring a criminal cartel case, it's an oligopoly, so they don't need to agree, so it's really hard. And then when we bring a merger case, it's like, oligopolistic conduct is really hard to occur, right? So there are some really fundamental principles that it would be great to see modified and adopted and accepted by the courts at that level. Frankly, at a universal level, as corny as this is going to seem, the reason why I wanted this job is I very much believe that there are significant market power problems in the United States economy. It is having substantial effect on everyday people. And so 5 years from now, the test in my book is, how much did we address that problem?
Thank you very much. Well, hopefully you'll all join me in thanking the panel for an excellent discussion. Thank you very much.